The Fort Erie Podcast with Brent Jones. Brent Jones starts now.
Hey, that's me. I'm Brent Jones. Welcome to the Fort Erie Podcast. This is episode number 60, and this is going to be a bit of a milestone episode, a celebration, episode 60. I understand that 60 you might think it's a bit of an odd milestone to celebrate. You might be asking, why wasn't there like a 50th episode celebration, or maybe coming up at the 75th episode? But I don't know. I just like the number 60. It's a bit of an odd milestone, but it feels significant to me. This 60th episode of the Fort Erie Podcast today will contain a lot of the features that you would expect this month in Fort Erie history, Fort Erie job leads. We'll be getting to your messages on the Byrd Box, all of that kind of stuff. But I'm also going to be doing something a little bit different. This is going to be a bit of a behind-the-scenes episode. It might be a little bit self-indulgent, but at times. But basically, it's going to be a clip episode. If you're not familiar with that term, if you think of like sitcoms back in the 80s or 90s, they would often do a clip episode where there'd be an episode where they would just feature like little flashbacks to previous episodes. That's basically what I'm doing today. I have no new guest for you, but I am going to play bits and pieces of interviews I did with previous guests that never sort of saw the light of day. Parts of the first 51 episodes that were never actually released. And if you're asking, Brent, why would there be parts that were never released? Well, for a whole number of reasons, but chief among them is that I used to arbitrarily make sure every episode of the Fort Erie Podcast was under 15 minutes. I used to brag about it being a bite-sized show. And there were a few reasons for that. One is that I think I thought it was going to be quicker and easier to make a shorter episode, 15 minutes. But as it turned out, the amount of editing I had to do to get every episode to fit within that 15-minute constraint actually created way more work for me in editing. I think I lacked confidence, too, that anybody would want to listen to this show for like longer than 15 minutes. Like anybody would pay attention to something that I was doing for longer than that. As a result of arbitrarily trimming down all these episodes, and it ended up being very formulaic. It was like, every episode I would go through Fort Erie news headlines, even if there were no interesting news stories from the week before. That's why in these newer episodes, you'll notice the content, the segments that I do change a little bit from one episode to the next. And the other thing that used to happen by trimming these episodes down is it often meant for the interview portion, I would sit down with a guest and I would talk to them maybe for 20 minutes or more. And then I would end up in editing, trimming down our conversation to only be 7 or 8 minutes. And as I say, like it watered things down a little bit, made it a bit formulaic because I'd cover a lot of the same things with the same guests, and we never really on the podcast got into a meaningful conversation. Not in all cases, but certainly in some cases. And then, of course, if I were to look back critically on the first 51 episodes of the show, there certainly were audio issues, especially in the later seasons, especially in season 5. In the early seasons, sort of pre-pandemic, like, I actually go out and I'd meet with my guests in person. I'd sit down with them face to face. We'd put on, I had these, they weren't expensive, but I had lapel mics that we'd use for the audio, and the audio came out okay. But in the later seasons, I started trying to find ways to do these interviews remotely. My setup wasn't as good then as it is now. I try to record phone calls or Zoom calls or that kind of thing. And quick tip, if you're going to record a Zoom call, make sure all the participants are wearing headphones. Otherwise, you end up with all kinds of awful echo and feedback, and it's very difficult to edit it out later. And so one of the strategies I used to use, if there was a whole piece of an interview where it was particularly noisy, didn't sound very good, I would just cut that whole part out, trim it out. I wasn't strong enough at editing audio at the time to really clean it up. Not as good as I am, let's say, at doing it now. And I say all this to say, do I have any regrets? No, not at all. I'm just sharing kind of behind the scenes with you, why episodes were shorter, why content got cut. There were, in the last few years, there have been a couple of other local, say, Fort Erie based podcasts that have come out. But I really don't think, in terms of any online content, podcast or otherwise, I don't think any local content creator has gone as deep into highlighting the town of Fort Erie as I think the Fort Erie podcast has. I don't think there's anything else that really sort of compares to this show. So was it perfect? Absolutely not. But I think but I'm proud of it. I'm proud of what I created. This isn't the Joe Rogan experience, by the way, guys. Like, I don't get paid to do this show, just in case any of you were wondering. This is something I do for my own amusement, and also because I think it supports our local community by demonstrating, what makes our town a great place to be. And now the other thing that I used to cut out to save time in these episodes, I used to cut out anything that was remotely controversial. If a guest said something that I thought was even the least bit inflammatory, I'd trim it. I'd cut it right out. I don't want to call it like censorship. It's just one of those things where it's like, I didn't want to be a political show. I didn't want to have a show that took a stand on much of anything. Now I don't really care as much. It doesn't matter. Like, I'm not going to go out of my way to offend anybody on the Fort Erie podcast, but I'm also not going to censor what guests have to say either. As a matter of fact, if we go all the way back to my very first guest, season 1, episode 1, Stephen Passero was, as I say, my very first guest. And Stephen Passero is known for all kinds of things. Aside from great trivia nights, fundraiser trivia nights, he's a former town councilor. He was a mayoral candidate. He was involved with Big Brothers Big Sisters, Fort Erie festivals, the Kinsman Pool back before they decided to turn it into a splash pad. And I'm going to play you a remark that he made during our interview for season 1, episode 1 back in 2019.
Would you ever consider getting back into local politics?
I would say I haven't left local politics, to be honest with you.
Okay,
I'm a firm believer that you don't have to be elected or on council to help create change in the community. So I'm still involved in a number of endeavors, and I still help people do different things on the municipal level. I'm just not front and center every Monday night. So it's nice to take a break, even if it's forced by the voters every 4 years. But I think it's good to reset, reconnect, and get involved in some different things during that time in between. I've always said that if you disappear after you lose an election, you weren't really running for the right reasons in the first place.
Now, I included that. That was not something that I cut from that podcast episode. I played that remark because I thought it was a truly noble thing that he said. He said, if you disappear after losing an election, you weren't running for the right reasons. But the second time I had Stephen on, season 5, episode 6, he had a strong response to when I asked him about what does the town need to do regarding our economic recovery sort of post-COVID. And I didn't include most of his response. Again, for time restrictions, of course, but also because I thought it was a bit spicy. And I'm like, I don't want to offend anybody. But I look back now, I play back that interview now, and even though, again, the audio wasn't perfect in it, we did it by Zoom, and I realized that was a huge mistake because the truth is, Stephen was exactly right. Let me play his answer, and you be the judge.
What do you think, what in your opinion, the next few years needs to happen in our town to really, let's say, kickstart economic recovery after some of these difficult times that our community has had for the last couple of years?
It's been a privilege and a pleasure to see the businesses that you spoke of open in town, to look at the number of ribbon cuttings that have been happening. But make no mistake, every time you see a ribbon cutting happening within a building, another business went out of business for that vacancy to occur. So it's not all rosy in the economic picture, nor is it elsewhere in Niagara or Ontario or the country for that matter. And I really don't think that a new plaza of 2 or 3 fast food restaurants is economic prosperity. It's great to attend a ribbon cutting, but I don't think those are the types of businesses that will float us in the long term. So I think the town definitely needs to continue their pursuit of the industrial land strategy that this council, the previous 2 councils I was privileged to be a part on, and councils prior to that had been working towards and adopted. It's really only through those types of strategies and actually putting money aside to get land that is feasible for development in place, so that when opportunities do kickstart again, we can take advantage of those. There's a reason why Welland and Port Colborne are well ahead of us in industrial land development. They started their strategies more than a decade ago. So we're lagging behind, but it's something we need to pursue. Unfortunately, politicians don't generally like to set money aside for something that's not going to happen for 5, 8, or 10 years. They like the quick win, the ribbon cutting in a couple of months. So it takes some political fortitude to step forward and say, we need to start setting this money aside now in a reserve so we can pull the trigger on these types of initiatives, even though it's not going to be us as current politicians with our names on the front page of the newspapers. But for the benefit of the town overall and those higher paying jobs that we all need, industrial and commercial development, we need to follow through with making sure the land we have that's zoned properly can actually facilitate a business when that business is ready to either locate here or expand their current operations.
This month in Fort Erie history.
One of my absolute favorite Fort Erie stories of all time happened on July 2nd, 1903. Now, it's kind of morbid, but this did happen this month in Fort Erie history. The story goes that Ed Delahanty, I hope I'm saying that correctly. He's a pretty famous baseball player of his time, Hall of Famer, batted over 400, 3 different years, 1894, 1895, and 1899. He drowned in the Niagara River in Fort Erie, July 2nd, 1903. That is the only part of the story we really know for certain. Ed drowned in the river. The part that's unclear 120 years later is whether this was an accident or whether it was a murder, whether it was intentional, somebody shoved him in the river. I'm reading a quote here directly from an article I've got pulled up. It says, by all accounts, after he and his Washington teammates boarded the train in Detroit, Delahanty got as drunk as a skunk and was subsequently thrown off a New York-bound train crossing the International Railway Bridge between Buffalo and Fort Erie. And just kind of a fun fact, I mentioned this incident happened 120 years ago. I believe that International Railway Bridge turns 150 this year. So anyway, there's a few theories about what happened here. Allegedly, this quote mentions that he was drunk as a skunk. Allegedly, he'd had 5 tall glasses of whiskey, and he began threatening other passengers on this train with a razor. So the story goes that possibly he was ejected from the train while it was going over the International Railway Bridge. Like in self-defense, people chucked him out of the train, and it just so happened to be on this bridge at the time, and he plunged into the river, and that's how he died. But what I find odd about that is that this man, Ed Delahanty, was 6'1". He was 180 pounds. He was not a small man by any stretch. He was also armed with a razor. And I assume he knew how to use it. This story seems unlikely to me, especially with witnesses. If in fact people had forcibly pushed him off of a train, it seems to me there would have been a few witnesses available who would have been able to say that that's what happened. Another popular theory is that he was robbed. That, the story goes that at the time he was carrying something like $1,500 of cash and valuables like jewels on him. And $1,500, I'm sure in 1903 was a whole bunch of cash. I'm sure that was quite a lot of money. So this story again seems pretty unlikely to me that, for this to happen, somebody would have had to assault this man, like beat him to death on the train and steal his valuables, then dump his body out of the train. It's not like you could dump his body out of the train and then go collect the valuables. So he would have had to have been assaulted on the train first, his possessions removed, and then thrown out of the train. When the body was eventually found, and it was found at the base of the Horseshoe Falls, Niagara Falls, a week later by one of the Maid of the Mist tourist boats. Now, I find that kind of funny. Again, this is kind of a morbid story, but I'm trying to look at the sort of the humorous side of it. Can you imagine, riding the Maid of the Mist? You're on your family vacation in Niagara Falls, and it's like you signed up to get, up close and personal with the falls, and instead you discover the body of a famous baseball player, and not just the body. The story goes that he was completely naked when they found his body, except for his tie, his shoes, and his socks. Tie, shoes, and socks. His pants were gone, but he still had his shoes and socks on. So who knows? Maybe there's some truth to this story. Maybe he was murdered upon the train. His body was ransacked. Items were removed from his person, and then his body was discarded. But again, it seems to me that on a train, especially full of his teammates, there would be witnesses to this. It doesn't seem like it would be a mystery 120 years later. So the most widely accepted theory goes that this train had made it across the bridge. It was in Fort Erie. And then in sort of a drunken stupor, Ed Delahanty gets off the train and walks back onto the bridge. I don't know why. It's not like he'd be sightseeing. Today, we think of sort of the skyline, like the Buffalo skyline being all lit up. But in 1903, I don't think there were a whole lot of skyscrapers with electric lights on. So it would have been pretty well pitch black. But the theory goes that he walked back onto the bridge, onto the railway bridge on foot, and then stumbled off of it, potentially, and fell the 25 feet or so into the river. Or that he was walking along the bridge and there were night watchmen in place at the time looking for smugglers attempting to cross the Canada-US border. So he's walking across the bridge. A night watchman mistakes him for a smuggler trying to enter the country illegally. And then they get into a scuffle and this watchman pushes him to his death. That's another possibility. But it seems like the most likely scenario that he voluntarily walked onto the bridge. And then what happened after that, we don't know for sure. And again, for context, I mentioned how dark it would be. This man is drunk. He's been drinking. There's no lights on the shore. It'd be pitch black in all directions. The river, as everybody knows, listening to this podcast, the Niagara River has a pretty mighty current to it. It is what becomes Niagara Falls. So, it would be very difficult for anyone, even an athlete like Ed Delahanty, to swim your way out of that. The water's 40 feet deep. You'd have no real sense of direction except for which way the current is carrying you. Most likely, this man was dead long before he went over the falls. The most likely scenario is that he would have drowned long before actually going over. So this story, I just say, is one of my favorite Fort Erie stories because it sounds like the kind of story that would have come out of Florida. Like the headlines that always start with Florida man, fights an alligator or something. It would have been like Florida man, jumps naked off a bridge to his death. I mean, but no, it's not a Florida story. This happened right here at home, right here this month in Fort Erie history.
It's Fort Erie's answering machine, the Byrd Box.
Welcome to the Byrd Box, Fort Erie. This is Fort Erie's answering machine. You can call it 24 hours a day. You can leave a message on any topic that you want. I call it the Byrd Box because the last 4 digits of the phone number spell BYRD. It's the only thing I can spell with the last 4 digits. You can call 289-599-2973. Squawk about anything you like. And I'm going to start today by playing a positive message.
I moved to Fort Erie last year, 2022, and one thing stood out for me. The people in this city have great hospitality. Like, from where I moved from, in Montreal, I really found a difference. And here I can actually interact with my neighbors, talk to random people at the grocery store, and I just feel at home. There's a great sense of community here, and I love it here. So I see myself living here for a long time.
Now, I love this. I love this call. This sounds very similar to my story in a sense, except that my wife and I moved here from North York, not from Montreal. But there's a whole contingent of us here in Greater Fort Erie who chose to be here because we appreciate this town, because it's a great place to be. And then there's a whole pocket of folks here in town who've been here forever since they've been born. And they'll tell you that this town has nothing going for it because the racetrack doesn't have slot machines anymore, because the Crystal Beach amusement park closed 34 years ago. It's ridiculous. So dear caller, thank you. Welcome to the town. I'm glad I'm glad you're here. And we are most certainly better off for having you. And then I'm going to play another message that I got this past week from a familiar caller, somebody who's called in before. Have a listen.
I'm just calling or shouting that everyone that lives in Fort Erie, Port Colborne, are having their urgent care being cut down tomorrow morning. So
I'm just going to pause it there. I'll play the rest of the message in a sec. But this message was left last week, like on July 4th, obviously, since it's talking about the new hours going into effect at the hospital on July the 5th. Anyway, let's keep playing through the message.
Tomorrow morning, urgent care will be open tomorrow at 10 a.m. and close at 10 p.m. However, the doors will be locked at 8 p.m. and the lights out at 10 p.m. What about some upset parent who is there carrying an injured or a senior who's having trouble breathing and can't drive distances at night? We live in Canada. These moves by the Premier go against the promise we have to equal, equitable health care for all. This goes against our rights and does not sound like a democratic move. It sounds like a dictatorship.
Now, she goes on later in this message to invite everyone to come out on July 5th for a protest in front of our hospital about the urgent care being closed overnight. And as I understand it, lots of people did come out last week to show their support. But just a recommendation, Fort Erie, if you're going to call the Byrd Box about something that is timely, something that's happening on a specific date, I encourage you to do it. It's a great use of the Byrd Box, but please don't wait until the day before your event is happening. Just to be clear, let me give you, this is a behind the scenes episode, right? So let me give you a little bit of behind the scenes. This isn't a daily show. I know, surprise everybody, surprise. I know a new episode comes out generally once a week if I have time to do it. Okay, if there's time to do it, there will be a new episode on ideally on every Tuesday. But this is not a daily show. So your messages sometimes come in and they have to wait a week before they end up on the next episode. And the other thing is that I don't record these episodes on the day that they come out. Like this episode you're listening to right now, it is Tuesday, July the 11th. The episode was released this morning on all the big podcasting platforms at about 6:30 a.m. Do you think I was in the office recording this episode at 5:30 a.m. this morning? Like, for context, today is Tuesday, July 11th that you're listening to this, but surprise, it's actually Thursday, July 6th right now. That's the time I'm recording this segment of the Byrd Box. So anyway, I love getting calls about events. Just get your calls in early because it takes me time to actually get to them and get them into an episode. Anyway, as far as the rest of her message, look, I'm not happy about our urgent care hours being reduced either. I'm really not happy about it. I don't think many people are happy about it. And she has every right to be upset. But comparing a reduction in our hours to a dictatorship, that's absurd. I mean, that is, look, if you want to protest something, it's important to be factual and be clear with your language. I think some folks around town might need to read a history book because the last time I checked, having to drive a half hour to receive free, high-quality medical care is not how most dictatorships are run. And by the way, if you think that 30-minute drive is rough, try living in Northern Ontario, where you might have to drive several hours to get to a hospital, say in Sault Ste. Marie or Sudbury, for example. So yes, like most people, I'm a fan of having one universal, single-payer, robust healthcare system, absolutely. But when she refers to our rights being taken away, she uses the word rights. Where does it say you have the right to have a hospital within 5 minutes of your house? I checked the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I checked the Ontario Human Rights Bill. I couldn't find that right anywhere. Now look, I am not mad at this caller, not by any stretch. In fact, I admire her very much. I've met this lady in person. She's a wonderful human being. And there were far too many people right now around our town happy to complain to their neighbors about what's going on with our hospital or write snide remarks on Facebook. But she's actually using her voice and mobilizing people to take action. And I'm rooting for her. And everyone else who's been sort of behind this cause, if I can say that, the Fort Erie Healthcare SOS Facebook group, all those folks, the people organizing these protests, the calls being made, the letters being written. I mean, you guys have my support, but the reality of our current situation, I think, is this: protest or no protest. Niagara Health, they heard our voices. They knew the position of people in Fort Erie and Port Colborne, and they went ahead with slashing the hours at our urgent care. So that's a done deal now. So now I think it's time to shift the conversation from, say, protest or complaint to solution, figuring out what do we do from here. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Fort Erie, because I think the first step here is really identifying what are the key issues that led to this happening in the first place, and how do we move forward with resolving them. I think of it like a jigsaw puzzle. It might be a 100-piece puzzle, but if you only have 50 pieces, it's going to be tough to sort of get the full picture. So what is really at the heart here? Is it a shortage of medical talent, like a smaller labor pool? Is it a lack of funding? Is it poor management? Is it certain elected officials that let's say are not representing our best interests? I have my own ideas, but this Byrd Box segment has gone on far too long already. So leave your messages on the Byrd Box, Fort Erie. Let me know what you think.
Have something you want to squawk about? Let the whole town know what's on your mind. Call the Byrd Box at 289-599-2973. That's 289-599-BYRD.
If you, for some reason or another, decided to skip over the beginning of today's episode, let me just mention that this is episode 60 of the Fort Erie podcast. It's a celebration episode. I'm taking you, dear listener, behind the scenes a little bit today. I'm playing some clips, some content from previous episodes that was never released, portions of my chats with guests that maybe hit the cutting room floor. And one reason why a part of an interview may have been cut is simply because it was a mistake. It was a blooper. It was like myself or my guest. We said something we didn't like, or something happened. And this isn't like live radio. I mean, I can edit things out if they don't sound good or if they weren't supposed to happen. So the kind of first up here, I'm going to share with you a couple parts from my interview with Tina Tourountzas back in 2019. Tina, if you don't know, is the owner of Southsides on Niagara Boulevard. Also one of the most fun guests that I think I've ever had on this podcast. She's a lot of fun. We went downstairs at Southsides. We're in kind of the basement area, and we were about a minute into our conversation when this happened.
It's just a hidden gem, I think.
I agree 100%. How long have you lived in Fort Erie? Oh, that's okay. We got a little phone call there. See, Tina's a busy person. That's okay. I'm so grateful for the time.
Hollywood, right?
That's
Hollywood.
It. That's it. You know what? I've still to this day, I've never told a guest to turn off their phone before the interview starts. I don't know. Maybe I should. But now, you know, since relaunching this podcast back in May, basically all the interviews I do are by phone. So there's no real risk of a phone ringing in the background. But at any rate, the phone rang. It was kind of funny. We played it off. I wasn't sure if I was going to include it in the episode or not. And then later, I used to do something in the early seasons of the Fort Erie podcast called the rapid fire question round, where I would just come up with a whole list that I found. Well, I say I came up with it. I Googled it. I found a whole list on the internet of just like stupid questions you can ask a guest. And so I'd ask 6, 7, 8 questions in just sort of rapid succession. And Tina got stuck on answering one of those questions. Have a listen. Well, let's talk about beverages. What's your least favorite beverage?
Least favorite beverage?
Yeah.
Gosh. What would be my least favorite beverage?
Especially as a bartender. Last thing you'd ever want to have to drink yourself.
Last thing? Oh, that's such a good question.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I don't tell my guests not to swear, by the way. I've never said, hey, please don't say any curse words on this podcast. Swearing doesn't bother me in the slightest. But I generally try to censor it if somebody does say something objectionable, just for the sake of listeners. And also because I don't want some of these podcast platforms to start slapping me with like an explicit content rating or something like that. So I will generally go back and censor it out. But Tina is in fact the only guest I ever had who swore while we were recording. Anyway, and then if we fast forward about a year, I sat down with Dino Kentros in 2020, early into the pandemic. Dino, if you don't know, is the owner and operator of The Barrel, one of my favorite restaurants in town here on Garrison Road. And we sat in sort of the party room that you can rent out. Now, when I sit down, and again, in the early seasons of the Fort Erie podcast, I used to generally always go out and meet my guests in person, sit down with them. We use lapel mics, and I would have a list of questions in front of me. Now, again, I mentioned at the start of this episode, my goal was to try to keep the conversations short so I wouldn't have to do as much editing. So I'd have a very sort of loose list of questions, like just a short couple of questions, and then I could, go off script if needed. But I don't know. I don't actually, maybe Dino remembers because I don't remember what happened this particular day, but I totally lost my place. It was like, we burned through the questions and then I had nowhere left to go. And there was just sort of this unnatural pause. So just here, listen to what happened.
And then I guess really aside from that, I may end up having to edit this part a little bit right here because I had a question for you and it just slipped out of my mind. So what was I just going to ask you about? Oh my God. Do you have a question you want me to ask you?
Maybe Ida. She's been here for since day one.
Yeah.
We interviewed her in this room on a crate.
Really?
Yeah, before anything was even in here. She's like our first employee here.
Okay. All right. Well, let me ask you about that. So can you tell me a little bit about, you got somebody named Ida, I believe it works here, right? Who's...
And then, of course, what do I do? Okay, so I end up asking the question about Ida. He gives a great answer. Ida is this wonderful person. She's still at the Barrel, by the way. It's 2023. She's still there. And anyway, but I love the way that probably in my moment of embarrassment, I totally tried to play it off. He goes well, ask me about Ida. And I'm like, okay. So he tells me about Ida. And then I go, so I heard there's somebody here named Ida, like as if he didn't just tell me that's what to ask. This is what happens, folks, by the way, behind the scenes. This is what's going on when podcasters interview people. It's like there are those awkward pauses and moments where people lose their place, and you can usually trim it all together to still make it sound very cohesive. So if you've ever thought about podcasting and you thought, man, I can't do that. I'm just not very well spoken. I'm not very sharp, sort of off the cuff. Look, even I can do this. if I can do it, you can do it too. Coming up later in the show, we'll go behind the scenes a bit more. I have more clips from past interviews to share with you. But let's first take a minute to talk about some Fort Erie job leads and Fort Erie questions and answers.
Fort Erie job leads.
If you are on the hunt for a new job, Fort Erie, I've got some leads. Hopefully this will point you in the right direction. First up, the town of Fort Erie is hiring a school crossing guard. This is a part-time and temporary position. The deadline to apply is by noon on July 27th. You can visit forterie.ca for details. Fort Erie Race Track has posted that they are looking to hire a part-time customer service person. This person would be selling programs for the races, t-shirts. It's about 15 hours a week, mostly Mondays and Tuesdays, and starting right away. You can email your application or resume, I guess, to jobs@forterieRacetrack.ca. The recruiting firm in town here, Employment Professionals Canada, has posted that they're looking for both an industrial electrician as well as warehouse admin support. I've got no idea who the employer is, but you can contact Employment Professionals Canada directly to get more details. Casa El Norte is looking to hire an executive director. This is a charity, as I understand it. The position is permanent and part-time, about 30 hours a week, flexible hours, some on-site and some remote work. Salary range $45,000 to $52,000 a year, plus benefits. Doesn't sound like a bad gig at all. Fort Erie Group Family Practice is hiring a medical receptionist. That's a full-time position, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Bill's Collision is hiring automotive painters. Again, the hours are day shift, basically, Monday through Friday. Pay is $25 to $30 per hour, depending on level of experience. All the supplies, paint guns, equipment, that kind of thing will be provided. Fleet Canada on Gilmore Road is hiring a cleaner. It's a full-time Monday to Friday day shift position. It actually sounds a bit more like custodial work based on the job description, things like sweep, mop, and vacuum floors using various cleaning supplies and equipment. Probably more of a custodian than just a general cleaner, let's say. And then apparently both No Frills and Golden Nugget Bingo are hiring customer service people, although I'm not certain about that. I can't verify it for you, so you'll have to make your own calls and inquiries to find out.
Fort Erie questions and answers based on the Facebook group by the same name.
Welcome to Fort Erie questions and answers. This is the part of the show where I go through the Facebook group by the same name and pick out any interesting questions that I found interesting, helpful, bizarre, or otherwise. And this past week, there were a few that I noticed that I wanted to share with listeners. Linda asks, where in Fort Erie can I get pure natural honey? The most common answer, or at least the one that I saw come up quite a bit in the comments, was Tender Cuts Quality Meats. They have unpasteurized honey from honey fields in Niagara-on-the-Lake. One commenter said, a lot of people mention that there's some kind of a stand on Dominion Road, just past Stone Mill Road. It doesn't mention east or west past Stone Mill Road, but allegedly near Dominion Road and Stone Mill Road. And I drive by that area all the time. I've never noticed it, but apparently there's some kind of stand at the side of the road where you can go buy raw honey or natural honey. So you may want to check that out. And one person also commented any of the farmers markets. And that's, of course, true. If you go to the Ridgeway Farmers Market on Saturday, Crystal Beach on Sunday, or Stevensville on Wednesday, you will for sure be able to get your hands on some natural honey. Darlene writes, looking for a price on house painting. She says, I just need 2 sides done because the front and back are already done. That's kind of funny, actually. So it's like you've got one color in the front and the back and then a different color on either side. Okay. She says, I am looking for student painters in all capital letters unless I get a comparable price. Unless you get a comparable price, Darlene. I mean, what are you saying? You want to exploit young people by paying them less than what the job is actually worth? Sounds a bit shady, if you ask me. Get a grip, Darlene. Pay people properly for the work that they do. Anyway, in the comments, there weren't really any good suggestions here for student painters, let's say, or people that could come out and paint her house. But a lot of people were volunteering to paint, even at student wages. A lot of people were saying, hey, I could do that. So lots of handy people around our town looking for work, I guess. Elaine asks, what is the best place in Fort Erie for an oil change? A couple of answers that I saw. There were actually quite a few answers, a lot of different responses here. Cartech Automotive on Jarvis Street, Birdie Tire, Bill's Toyota. The top response that I saw in the comments, though, was Garrison Automotive. That's the one that came up the most often. And the last question I wanted to read or go through was Chris asks, does anybody know if the RoboMart still sells the soft ice cream? I take that to mean soft serve. I'll just give you the synopsis because, again, there were a ton of comments on this. The synopsis is an overwhelming yes. Sounds like the debit machine might be broken. You might have to pay for your ice cream with cash. It sounds like since the ownership changed at the RoboMart, maybe the soft serve isn't exactly the same, but the answer is yes. But somebody in the comments, this is what made this question the most interesting to me. Somebody in the comments said, I'm fairly new to town. Where is RoboMart? Thanks. Like, in the amount of time it took this person to type that comment, they could have just Googled it. Like, good God, like if you can use Facebook, surely you can look up the location of RoboMart on Google Maps yourself. Nonetheless, somebody responded with a very helpful screenshot of Google Maps showing this user where RoboMart is. Yeah, I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
The Fort Erie Podcast.
Today, I'm taking you behind the scenes to share some parts of my chats with previous guests, little bits that never made it to the final episode. I mentioned at the start of today's episode that, I used to edit episodes down for length. I try to keep everything contained under 15 minutes. Now, I don't care. Episodes are 40 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour. It doesn't matter. But I used to have this thing about keeping everything down to 15 minutes. So my guests who were a little bit more, so let's say naturally chatty, the talky folks, those guests got penalized in a sense because, they shared more with me and less of it made it to the final product. Now, I talk to people, throughout the first 51 episodes of the Fort Erie podcast, I talked to people all over the town of Fort Erie, including Ridgeway, Crystal Beach, and Stevensville. And I have to say that people in Crystal Beach definitely have the most to say. There's lots going on there, I guess, but they by far have the most to say. Some of the longest raw interviews I ever did were with guests from Crystal Beach. Now, I also mentioned earlier in this episode that I used to do something in the early seasons, the early episodes called the Rapid Fire Question Round. And that was basically, I went on the internet, I found a list of like 100 dumb questions or 200 dumb questions you could ask people, and I'd put them on the spot and make them answer these questions as quickly as they could, just as a fun way for listeners to learn more about the guests that I was sitting down with. And there was only one episode, I think from the first couple of seasons of this show, only one that I'm aware of that didn't have a rapid fire question round. And that wasn't because we didn't do it. It's just simply because we ran out of time because there was so much other stuff to talk about, and I ended up trimming it out. And that one interview was my very first chat with Phil Smith back in 2019. Now, Phil has been on the Fort Erie podcast 3 times. He's a 3-peat guest, and we've talked about just about everything: his involvement in the Crystal Beach BIA, his restaurant South Coast Cookhouse. He's a fellow realtor, so we've talked real estate, and I'm sure now at some point he'd love to come back on the show and talk about his latest developments there along Hot Dog Alley, including Hotel Philco. But since I never actually played his rapid fire question round from his very first appearance on the show, I'm going to play it for you right now. Here it is. Before we go any further, I want to jump into the rapid fire question round. This is going to be like 60 seconds.
I didn't study for it.
I know this, and these are just fun questions so people can learn a little bit more about Phil Smith. All right. So, all right. What is the lowest grade you've ever been given? What class was it?
Geez, I wasn't the best student in school, but I would probably say probably French.
French was low?
I don't think I ever failed anything, but it wasn't very bon, which is good.
So you got something out of it.
Yeah.
If you could choose your own nickname, what would it be?
Choose my own nickname. Well, my nickname has always been Philco.
Philco?
Yeah,
all right.
People call me Philco just because when we were young kids, I was always sort of, it was sort of for the Phil company.
Got it. What's your best feature?
Geez, that's a great one. I don't know. I guess my best trait anyways is I try to remain calm. I try to remain level-headed. So,
would you prefer a weekend at the cottage or a weekend on the boat?
Cottage with a boat.
Cottage with
a boat.
What song best summarizes your career?
Oh my God. Can we come back to that?
Pass. We'll take a pass.
Yeah.
What's your greatest accomplishment?
My greatest accomplishment, I think, is probably, South Coast.
Yeah.
Like been able to create something that people have rallied around. And, I think that's pretty cool.
And just lastly, with all the things you're involved in, how many keys do you have on your key ring?
Oh man, how many key rings do I have? I bet you we were just doing something the other day. I think there was, 70 or 80 different keys.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just...
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fun.
Yeah, it's all color-coded and a whole bit.
I kind of imagine that the thing he's most proud of might have changed from his restaurant, maybe now to being married and having a kid. I hope the family he's more proud of than the restaurant now. And I also wonder if we'll ever find out. I really should go back and ask him someday if we'll ever find out what song best sums up his career. Maybe we'll never know. Then another Crystal Beach guest I'm going to share with you just across the way from South Coast Cookhouse at Derby and Erie. I spoke to Keith McTague, who along with his partner Ashlyn Ross, they operate Planks Canada, kind of right there on the corner. And a common question I used to ask a lot of guests, and I stopped asking this question, and you're going to find out why very, very shortly. But I used to ask, kind of small independent business owners, I'd ask them if there were any other sort of local or nearby businesses that they wanted to give some praise to or give a shout out to. And the idea here was that I thought, a small local business maybe has another small local business that they try to send business to each other. I expected their answer to contain one or two other businesses, but the response that Keith gave me here was pretty typical. This is what usually happened when I would ask this question. Have a listen.
But just to conclude, are there any other Crystal Beach businesses that you'd specifically like to give a shout out to?
Oh, well, all of them. Of course, I love the scene in the last couple of years has just exploded. Like, we have new restaurants, San Vito's and Casa Hugo. We got the Mexican Italian thing going on now. Of course, South Coast Cookhouse has always been an anchor in Crystal Beach. The Breakfast Beacons come to town and they're doing some delicious stuff. The Crystal Ball is always a great place, beautiful patio. And then, of course, the new retail. We were kind of the first kind of retail in 2016 that was really happening. And then shortly after, the Apothecary joined, and she's still around. So the Apothecary is a great little place. But the last year has been the most with the restaurants I mentioned, Rain Activewear across the street, taking our old spot and doing some beautiful stuff in there. Some nice, I think even Canadian made clothing and stuff. Of course, the Wag Boutique is now a new addition to the street. And we have Big Pappy's gourmet grilled cheese and hot dogs. I really missed his hot dog eating contest this year. I actually participated last year. It was very tasty. And yes, the two newbies. So we have the Mercantile down across from the beach entrance there, and the Beach Market on Derby Road. So we're really happy to see Derby Road coming more alive, and Crystal Beach just won't stay down. It just keeps on going.
Yeah, it keeps going, buddy. That's for sure. I'm sorry, Keith. I'm sorry. I'm not poking fun at you. It was a very, very long answer. And anyway, but this was typical. This isn't just Keith. This is what tended to happen every time I asked this question. I'd ask a guest, and at first they were like, oh, I don't know. They'd think of one or two. And then suddenly I think they'd panic. Like they'd be concerned that if they left somebody out, that they'd end up offending that business. So they'd try to list like every local business they could think of within 10 miles of them. The same thing happened when I interviewed Carol and Alexandra Lachavita at the Village Boutique in Ridgeway. I asked them about another Ridgeway business or businesses they thought deserved a shout out for sort of enduring during the pandemic. And they even started listing businesses that weren't even in Ridgeway. It was like Crystal Beach and Fort Erie and all over the place. At some point, I learned to stop asking my guests this question. But what is nice to know, what is nice to take away from that is that people around town, especially our small business owners, love supporting other local business owners. And that's awesome. I have a bit of a surprise to end today's episode coming up. Stay tuned. It's happening right now. This is especially for longtime listeners. I think you're going to like this. Hang on. Did you like that transition, the old transition from the first 51 episodes? Here it is again. Yeah, that's right. I even brought back the old music, the old jingles for today's episode. Let me hit play on the whole theme song. I'm sure this will sound familiar to a lot of you. This song slaps, just my opinion. It's a bop for sure, as the kids would say in 2023. I bought the license, like the rights to this song back in 2019 to use it specifically on the podcast as like a theme song, the intro, the outro, the transitions, because I thought it sounded kind of fun and folksy, and I thought hang on, let me stop the music. Okay. So, I thought it fit our town well. It was upbeat. And when I relaunched the Fort Erie podcast back in May, I decided to go for more of a radio show vibe, with DJ drops between the segments. Which do you prefer? The old theme song, The new DJ drops. I don't know. Do you have an opinion, dear listeners? If you've been listening to the show for a long time, you certainly know that song I was just playing. So anyway, call the Byrd Box. Let me know. Which do you prefer? 289-599-2973. Anyway, to conclude today's episode, if you caught episode 59 that was released last week on July the 4th, I called the town to ask about Burley Road. After a whole number of you, two of you called the Byrd Box to complain about the condition of Burley Road, the stretch between Dominion and Thunder Bay. Here's the message I left for the town last week. Oh, hi there. My name is Brent Jones, and I live in Ridgeway. I'm a local realtor with Remax Niagara, and I also host a local online show called the Fort Erie Podcast. I don't know if you're the right person to speak to, but the reason I'm calling is that I do a segment each week on the Fort Erie Podcast where I ask local folks around our town to call in any things they see around town, good, bad, or otherwise. And I've now had several calls from folks complaining about the condition of Burley Road, specifically the part that spans from Dominion down to Thunder Bay. Now, I know the town just kind of went in there and packed some of the potholes with asphalt. That happened just a few weeks ago, but the road itself is still pretty rough. So I was just wondering if the town has any plan to fix or redo that stretch of road. And if so, if you might consider giving me an update that I can share with my listeners. You know what? As a matter of fact, I'll actually give you the call-in line for the Fort Erie Podcast, the phone number. I call it the Byrd Box because the last 4 digits spell BYRD. But if you want to call in and leave a voicemail there, I can easily play it for listeners to hear. The number is 289-599-2973 or just simply 289-599-BYRD, Byrd. Well, I'm very sorry to say, dear listeners, that I did not get a response from the town. Nobody called me back. I didn't get a message on the Byrd Box. What a shocker. The town of Fort Erie didn't call me back. But anyway, here's what is cool about this story. Here's the happy ending. Episode 59 came out last week, dropped July 4th, as I mentioned. And you know what else happened on July 4th? The town began working on replacing Burley Road. They tore up the whole road from Dominion down to Thunder Bay. And I almost couldn't believe it. I only noticed because I was driving by, as I drive by that road many days. And oh my God, the whole road, I drove the whole way down the road. The whole thing is torn up. Now, I can't take credit for that. I wish I could. I wish I could say, man, I left the message for the town. We talked about Burley Road for couple weeks on the podcast. It must be completely my doing. It was not my doing. Okay. I wish I could take credit for it, but I can't. I'm sure if I went back and scoured notes from town council meetings, it was probably in there somewhere where the town had approved funding. They had money earmarked for this project. They had dates planned. I'm sure this was already pre-planned and I had nothing to do with it. But nonetheless, I thought the timing was coincidental. It did make me smile. Same day that episode dropped last week, the town got to work on fixing that stretch of road. Long overdue, I'd say, because for a side street, if we can call it that in Fort Erie, that road gets a lot of traffic. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed taking a little trip down memory lane with me today. I know this episode was a bit self-indulgent, but thank you for celebrating the 60th episode with me today. 61 will be on its way shortly, so subscribe wherever you get podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, wherever. And get your messages in on the Byrd Box so I can play them in the next episode, 289-599-2973. Any topic, doesn't have to be serious, can be fun, lighthearted, anything you see around town. So long, Fort Erie. I will chat with you again soon.
You've been listening to the Fort Erie Podcast with your host, Brent Jones, a sales representative with Remax.
I'm just kidding. We're not going to use the old outro. I'm going to use the new one instead. Here we go.
You've been listening to the Fort Erie Podcast with your host, Brent Jones. Never miss an episode. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or visit theforteriepodcast.com.